All right. Welcome everyone to the inauguration seminar talk of our IMIM 2025. Today, our speaker is Mike from the University of British Columbia, and the title of his paper today is Optimal Monetary Policy with Global Currency Pricing. Mike is an international economist, and his research focuses on international macroeconomics and international finance. So the seminar will run about 60 minutes, including Q&A and a separate discussion. All right, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Ron, and thank you so much for the invitation. I feel really honored to kick off the 2025 seminar series. So this paper is co-authored with Rui Liu at CUHK, Kang Shi at CUHK, and Wanyi Zhu, or Jenny Zhu at HKUST. So I think you probably know Kang Shi and Jenny Zhu quite well. They're very well-known economists. Kang Shi actually is going to be moving to Tsinghua and is already kind of underway. Rui Liu is a PhD economist at CUHK, and let me tell you, you're going to be hearing a lot about Rui Liu in the years to come. She's a brilliant PhD student. So this paper is a kind of a speculative paper about a type of currency, a virtual currency that could come into existence and impact on the way monetary policy is done, impact on international transmission, and impact on the global pricing policies. So our kind of start off on this research was the whole literature on the currency of export pricing, of which there is a vast number of papers over the last 10 or even 20 years. So, as we know, starting from, back, way back, even in Krugman, the currency of invoicing is a really important issue in understanding international macro transmission, international macro policy. So there's three well-known specifications: the PCP, producer currency pricing; LCP, local currency pricing; and the more recent DCP, the dominant currency pricing, normally thought of as dollar currency pricing. And each have, important differences for exchange rate pass-through, optimal monetary policy transmission, etc. And then there's, a big question about what drives a firm's choice of invoicing currency. Then, there's input-output linkages, complementarity and price setting. Then the size of the economy, the US's large economy advantage. And so there's been, a lot of recent literature, both theoretical and empirical, on this. So what do we do in this paper? Well, as I said, this is kind of a speculative paper. We explore the possibility of a global currency pricing, which is, we think of it as a virtual currency, or a virtual digital currency. So, there's been a number of suggestions in the literature, in the recent literature on maybe the literature on CBDCs and other kind of virtual currencies, that there may be a basket type currency framework that could be adopted by firms in their trading policies and their pricing policies. So this this idea was directly suggested by Meta, or what used to be Facebook, in their Libra proposal. This was abandoned, but Libra was a basket currency. We do have currencies which are baskets now. So the SDR is a virtual currency, which is a basket of renminbi, the US dollar, the UK pound, euro, and I think some other currencies. it's also kind of related to the idea of stable coins, like a basket currency tied to other currencies. So we're going to just explore the possibility of this, and we ask the following questions within a very standard framework. How would a global currency differ from a traditional invoicing methods like PCP, LCP, DCP? Then the question is, if we had such a virtual global currency basket, how should we design it? How should the shares of different national fiat currencies be allocated under the global currency basket? And then, finally, perhaps more importantly, would GCP, a global currency pricing, be endogenously chosen if so we suddenly say created this kind of basket currency? Would it become adopted by firms at the micro level? Because we're interested in the invoicing choice of firms. So there are basically the three questions we ask in this paper. So the framework we look at is very, very standard. It's a new Keynesian open economy framework. It's a simplified version of Galli, Molicelli, and Mukin. And so within this, we compare different pass-through choices, different equilibrium allocations, and optimal policy. We look at both cooperative and non-cooperative policy making, and that's important because while the results for cooperative and non-cooperative policy often don't differ very much in the kind of standard literature, PCP versus LCP. In fact, in our framework, they're exactly the same. In the GCP framework, the two can differ quite radically. So then we asked, given optimal policy, what would be the endogenous currency choice if this type of basket was created and was available for invoicing by firms? So that's basically the framework of the paper. Let me kind of summarize the main findings before I jump into describing the model. Essentially, well, like in any open economy, in terms of policy, there's a tension between targeting domestic objectives and international objectives like international trade allocation. And we find that there's actually quite a big difference between cooperative and non-cooperative frameworks. Under a cooperative framework, optimal policy is like a linear combination of a response to domestic objectives and a response to what we call a purely hypothetical monetary instrument, which we denote as a Bitcoin. So there's a little bit of craziness in this paper. We have two hypothetical baskets. We have our GCP, which is, as I'll define it in a minute, and we have another super hypothetical instrument, which we call a Bitcoin, which is we're not really focused on this. It's just kind of, an as-if instrument. It's useful just to define what policy would be. We find, under a cooperative policy, large countries should be underweighted in the global currency pricing. Under non-cooperative policy, we get the opposite, that larger countries should have a higher weight. So so basically the result is that the question is, how should we design a global currency? And it turns out that the design is going to depend very critically on the degree of international cooperation. Large countries should have a lower weight if we have cooperation, and a higher weight if we do not. Then the big question is, is GCP, would it be useful in a welfare sense in the world economy? So what we find is it always dominates local currency pricing, and it always dominates dollar currency pricing. The welfare currency pricing between the global currency pricing and PCP can go one way or the other, and it really depends upon the limitations of monetary policy response. If monetary policy is completely perfect, if it has full precision, then PCP tends to be better. But with some limitations on monetary policy response, in particular, if monetary policy is affected by financial shocks, we find GCP can be a welfare optimal allocation. Then finally, to summarize the findings on the endogenous currency choice, we outlined two scenarios where the introduction of global currency will actually lead to equilibrium adoption. So our inference then is if we set up this global currency and it was widely available as an invoicing vehicle, then it would be adopted under two different scenarios, and I'll explain the scenarios then. And then at the very end of the paper, this wasn't, I think, in the original paper that I submitted, but in the new version, we have a little kind of dynamic experiment of a transiting from DCP to GCP. We start an economy where it's dominated by dominant currency pricing, and we drop into this economy the possibility of this new global currency basket, and we show the conditions under which we'll transit away from dollar currency pricing to global currency basket. So that's kind of the main findings. So I'll kind of jump into the model now and describe what we do. So the model it's an N country. There's N countries where N can be anything. In country I, there's a continuum of N sub I households, and so the total population of the world economy is just normalized to 1. And just for reference, we set country 1 as the US, although I'm not going to talk very much about that. So each country has its own fiat currency, and the exchange rate between currency I and J is denoted as epsilon IJ. We call it EIJ, Mathcal E. So and then an increase is a depreciation in the standard interpretation. So here's what we define as our global currency basket. It's just a geometric average of each exchange rate with respect to a basket. So E1G is the exchange rate of the US country 1 against the basket, E2G country 2, and so forth. And the weights on this basket add up to 1. So the exchange rate between currency I and the global currency then can be defined as the geometric weight of each individual bilateral exchange rate against global against its other trading partners. So alpha I then represents the share of currency I within the global currency basket. Okay, the rest of the economy is very straightforward. There's preferences, there's a labor supply decision, a consumption bundle. Just to make things easy, we have complete markets, but in most of the analysis, this wouldn't matter because we have essentially like the Kohl-Obstfeld specification in any case. So we have sticky prices in the model. Of course, that's what we need to make things work. But we have, a one-period version of Talgo pricing following Dimitri Mukin's paper. So we have a fraction of firms can set goods prices at the beginning of, really have to set good prices at the beginning of T, and while fraction 1 minus theta have flexible prices. Productivity shocks, we're going to start at the beginning, their only shocks are these productivity shocks. And we assume that, within each country, there's a measure of non-traded goods and traded goods. But there's a linear production function for both sectors, non-traded and traded goods. And that's, fairly straightforward. So equilibrium is quite standard. We just have, the goods market clearing for each economy. And, we have a continuum of goods within each country. So we have the standard price dispersion terms in the equilibrium. So we're going to define monetary policy as just the control of a money supply instrument, because it's a static model, so we don't have interest rates in the model. But we could think of these as kind of shadow interest rates or something. But just for easy reference, we'll describe it as money supply. So we define kind of the global currency supply as just the basket-weighted sum of individual monetary policies. So there's no one there's no direct control of this global money supply. It's controlled individually by countries, and then the global monetary policy is just the weighted sum of these. And from the risk-sharing condition, the exchange rate between any two countries is just the difference in the money supplies or the monetary policy instruments. So that's the way it works. So the meat of the analysis really looks at how optimal monetary policy is going to be determined. And monetary policy is only desirable because of the inefficiencies due to price rigidity. We subsidize away all the monopoly distortions just to get rid of that. So the efficient allocation in this super simple model is just that the consumption, the tilde consumption is the efficient consumption. The efficient consumption of non-traded goods should be just proportional in log terms to the non-traded good productivity shock. The equivalent for traded goods should be the traded goods productivity shocks. So CJI is the consumption of country J good by country I, and that should be proportional to the productivity shock in country J. Now then, because of pricing inefficiencies, because of sticky prices, firms of measure theta have sticky prices. We have these deviations from efficiency. And this is really the role for policy here. But the deviations from efficiency are going to be really dependent upon the type of pricing policy or invoicing policy. So with PCP, the deviations from efficiency for the consumption of good J by country I are going to depend upon country J's policy, that is the source country policy under PCP. Under LCP, it's the opposite. It's the destination country's policy. That is the country I consumption of country J good is going to depend upon country I's monetary policy. In dominant currency, then it's all going to depend on country one or the US's monetary policy. Now, finally, in the global currency pricing, the deviation is going to depend upon MGT, which, remember, is the basket-weighted sum of all individual countries' monetary policies. So note that in all cases, the target you want is ZJT. So the target for consuming good J for any country I is the productivity in that country J in the source country. Okay, so that's the framework. Then we can plug all this stuff into a loss function for optimal monetary policy. And I'm not going to go through all this loss function. It's just, it's a quadratic, linear quadratic policy, which we get just from kind of second order expansion. And the loss functions depend upon, again, the deviation of policy from the optimal responses, the optimal productivity responses. And again, we can see that there's 4 different loss functions depending upon the different invoicing strategies. And the loss functions are, exactly dependent in the way I described the deviations from efficiency. And so we can cycle through the optimal monetary policies. So there's, 2 2 tasks for monetary policy here. There's a difference between the non-traded and traded good productivity shock. And this would be the case even in a closed economy, because we have 2 sectors and 2 different productivity shocks. We're going to assume that away just for now, just for this this discussion. So we're going to assume that the non-traded goods and traded goods within each country have the same shock. It just makes things more complicated to have differences there. But the productivity shocks across countries, of course, are going to be different. And this causes currency misalignment, in the standard definition that Charles Engel coined. And so the optimal monetary policy has to deal with this. So I'm going to go, very briefly just describe what policy would be with PCP, LCP, and DCP. So with PCP, actually, under these circumstances, there is what we call is what did Blanchard call it? Anyway, I've forgotten what we call it. You just target the domestic the domestic productivity shock, and so you can actually, with PCP under this specification, you can get kind of a first best response. With local currency pricing, you target a domestic and a foreign country weighted sum of foreign shocks. And there's going to be inefficiencies with local currency pricing. With dollar currency pricing or dominant currency pricing, there's a difference between the dominant currency and the individual countries. So if you're not a dominant currency, again, you just follow the PCP rule. You just target your own shock. For country 1, the dominant currency, you will target a domestic shock and a trade-weighted sum of foreign shocks. So this is stuff that's kind of pretty much already in the literature. That's not really of all that much interest. What we're really interested in is what will the optimal policy be under global currency pricing, and then what, given an optimal policy framework, what would be the optimal formation of a global currency basket. So in order to do that, then we take a kind of a roundabout route. We take a purely hypothetical currency, and this is what we're going to call it, just to be cute about it, we're going to call it a Bitcoin currency. So what's a Bitcoin currency? So just imagine that in addition to N national currencies, there existed a completely separate currency with separate money supply, independent, or separate policy we can think of, independent of all other currencies. And it's kind of an as-if unit of account. This is not part of our analysis. We're just saying, it's helpful to think in this way, just to define what the GCP optimal would be. So just imagine if all international trade were priced in this pure purely hypothetical Bitcoin unit of account, then this actually adds another monetary instrument. There's n monetary instruments in the PCP and GCP, but there's actually n plus one with Bitcoin pricing. So then in this hypothetical situation, we would have a very efficient response. Each country would just target its own shock, its own productivity shock, and then this purely hypothetical Bitcoin policy would target a trade-weighted sum of country-specific shocks, where Ni times 1 minus Ni essentially captures a measure of a country's international trade importance, where Ni captures its measure of its exports, and 1 minus Ni a measure of its imports. So the Bitcoin policy would be described in this dual way. Now, we're not really interested in what this Bitcoin is. It's only as a stepping stone to define the global currency pricing. So the global currency pricing optimal would look like this. You would have, for any country, you would have policy would be described as a response to its domestic shock plus a function of the gap between our hypothetical Bitcoin basket and the actual basket from the global currency pricing. Remember, this basket is just a trade-weighted sum of individual, not a trade-weighted, it is the global currency basket share sum of individual policies, where the global currency basket response in this case would be a function of the individual shocks and this hypothetical Bitcoin policy. So let me kind of just describe in words what this policy would be. So the optimal policy in this case would be, it's like a compromise between domestic objectives and closing the gap between the Bitcoin target policy and the optimal GCP target. So you want to basically have this as targeting domestic objectives and then this gap. So this gap is kind of a welfare gap that would be targeted by each country. Now, the key thing is, in the cooperative setting, all countries will agree on this target, this optimal global currency policy, global currency basket policy. So it's like there is a positive externality. So all countries agree and they all contribute to this in their individual policy choice. And there's two features of this that are important. Currencies with a larger share in the global currency basket will deviate more from targeting their individual productivities. And then larger countries will deviate more from targeting the global currency basket. So that kind of goes the opposite way. If you have a large share in the global currency basket, you do more to try to close this gap. But if you're a larger country, you focus more on your domestic objectives rather than this gap. So there's kind of a tension there, which I'll kind of explain in a kind of simple example. But the question is, these results are described for a given basket where there's a given share of each currency in the basket. But we'd like to answer the following question, given the optimal policy response, what would be the welfare optimal basket? that is, what would be the welfare optimal choice of shares in this global currency basket, in this GCP? And the answer is in this proposition. So the optimal shares would actually be exactly the weights that are in the Bitcoin optimal response. So the optimal currency shares would be determined by the weight of each country in international trade, which is basically its export share multiplied by its import share. And that is actually exactly the weights that we found in this kind of shadow currency, the Bitcoin currency. So under this policy, if we designed the global currency basket in this way, we could see that we'll actually close this gap completely. And each country would then only have to target its own domestic shock. And then when it does that, because the optimal share is designed according to what we found in the Bitcoin policy, given that optimal share, the global currency would respond in the efficient way. So the result, I think, is kind of intriguing in a way. It says that how would global monetary policy, end up if we had this global currency basket where each country firms were using the GCP as their invoicing currency? What would optimal policy be? Well, it would turn out to be exactly as the optimal policy in producer currency pricing. Each country would just target its own productivity shock, but the optimal basket shares would be designed so that that actually supports a completely cooperative equilibrium. So in some sense, you wouldn't need cooperation here. You see what I mean? Because each country would just do what it does in PCP, but because this hypothetical kind of global planner is choosing these shares, then you've got this really nice outcome that it supports a global optimum. Even though we don't have PCP in pricing, we have GCP. So it's kind of like you get a full circle back to support an optimum. So I really like this result. Anyway, one of the interesting things is
sorry, one quick question. So this GCP is done either through a Bitcoin or like a central.
No, the Bitcoin is just something in the background. It's good to think about it, but essentially what I'm saying is that, okay, let's say you had a global conference where all the major currencies.
So it's like the IMF choosing the SDR like every period.
Yeah, exactly. Say the IMF convened this big conference and they negotiated on weights in a global currency basket. Then they would choose these weights, and then they would say, just go home and do what you do normally with monetary policy. Just target your own productivity shocks, and everything will work out fine. So
okay.
that's your question.
Yeah.
Sorry, Mick, but just to make sure, right? But the allocation will be different. The optimum policy will be the same, but it's not like you replicate the first best allocation.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the allocation, you don't get the first best because this is under global currency pricing. This is the optimal allocation. This is the first best it's the second best, but it's the best you can do under a global currency basket.
I see. Right. So the optimal thing that each central bank should do is the same as PCP, but the welfare change.
Yeah, because under under PCP, you can actually get the first best because of, it's actually, I've forgotten this, what the Blanchard thing, because of the divine coincidence. And we never really believe in the divine coincidence, but under PCP, you can't, because of the divine coincidence, you do get the first best. What I'm saying, this proposition says that, you know, if we have a GCP, then the best way to get at it would be to have these shares. And then, but the policy response then would be the same as under PCP. So, and you know, in some sense, because we have a very simplified framework here, we're, you know, the welfare weighting is always going to be towards PCP, because, you know, that is the optimal policy because of the divine coincidence here. But you know, I'll talk later, unless I run out of time. About how this would differ in if we had you know, some extensions. So here's what the weights look like, you know, the optimal GCP weights. You would actually downweight countries relative to their size slightly here. So larger countries would have a smaller size than their weights in the world economy. And, you know, why is that? Because essentially larger countries will be more focused on their own domestic policy and not on this kind of international, the kind of the global good. So we can see here, this is in a two-country case where the optimal GCP is actually 0.5 irrespective of size, because in a two-country case, you know, n 1 minus n is the same for however n is whatever, whether n is 0.1 or 0.9. So the optimal size, the welfare optimal size is half. And then just let me focus on the right-hand picture here. So this is global welfare as a function of country size, on the country size on the horizontal, and the share on the vertical. And as I said, the share is always half. That maximizes global welfare. But the share that minimizes global welfare would be the share would be to have a high share, a one share for the larger country. So you want, in this particular example, you want the larger country. You want both countries to have equal shares, but if you give the larger country the top share, the highest share, then you get the worst global welfare. It essentially because it will focus more on its domestic objective. Okay, so I don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to basically state the results under optimal non-cooperative monetary policy. In this case, our kind of shadow currency, the Bitcoin policy, would be different. And the key thing is that under the cooperative monetary policy, kind of logically, everyone would agree on what this Bitcoin target is. Under non-cooperative monetary policy, this Bitcoin target would be different for each country. They would be only targeting their import weights and not their full trade weights, so that they would have this dual policy. They would target their domestic. If they had this flexibility of Bitcoin, they would use their domestic policy to target the domestic shock, and they'd use their shadow Bitcoin policy to target imports. And then when we put this, again, this is just an as-if situation, but when we put this into the global currency pricing under non-cooperative policy, then we would find that each country, again, would be trying to close a gap between its kind of shadow Bitcoin optimum and the actual global currency basket, the global currency policy, but the gap would be different for each country. So there'd be this kind of negative externality. And then the key result from this is that what we find is that larger countries should have a bigger weight in the global currency. This is just a two-country case. Again, larger countries should have a bigger weight in the global currency under non-cooperative policy. So, because a larger country, has a larger weight in international trade under optimal policy. So, its non-cooperative optimum will do better in terms of achieving the welfare maximizing currency basket policy response. So there's a key difference between small and between cooperative and non-cooperative policy. So then, as Dima pointed out, all these results are conditioned on the fact that there's going to be some distortions or welfare losses just because we don't have the flexibility of adjusting individual prices according to PCP. So from a welfare sense, it will all, even with this global currency, it'll still be the case that PCP dominates in welfare terms when policy is chosen optimally. But we're not convinced that that's the best way to think about policy. So we extend the model to allow for some imprecision in monetary rules here. So we say that, okay, instead of money supply or policy being able to target perfectly individual country productivity shocks, we allow for some discrepancy or deviations here. And we're thinking about these maybe as financial shocks. So policy can target productivity shocks, but there's these deviations. So we can take them velocity shocks. I mean, the model is so simple, we can't really introduce explicitly financial shocks in because we don't have any other sectors, but this is a simple kind of proxy way to do it. And we're assuming these shocks are orthogonal, so they're country specific. And you can kind of see immediately why these shocks would matter, because these shocks are going to be diffused under a global currency pricing, and that's going to make global currency pricing more desirable. So I'm not going to go through the full analysis here with these extended shocks, but I can just describe the loss function. The loss function is going to be in two parts now. It's dichotomized between the loss function under currency misalignment, again, because of this pricing policy and global currency pricing, there's still going to be some misalignment because the monetary policy can't close all gaps. But then there's going to be also a monetary volatility segment of the loss function. And optimal policy just can target the first part of this loss function. According to our assumptions, policy cannot control these financial shocks or the gap, financial shocks or velocity shocks. And then what we find is the optimal global currency design then is in two parts. This first part is exactly as before, the share should be trade-weighted, the share should be trade-weighted as, the optimal kind of quote unquote Bitcoin. But then the optimal global currency design to minimize monetary volatility should depend, inversely on monetary volatility. So the optimal currency will be just some compromise between these two goals. And then in the welfare ranking, we find that in terms of reducing currency misalignment, we'd always want PCP, but in terms of reducing monetary volatility, GCP would be preferred to any of the other situations. so then, okay, so that's just assuming, optimal policy and a welfare discussion between a welfare comparison between the two outcomes. Okay, so then the last part of the paper looks at the question I mentioned at the beginning. Under what conditions will firms endogenously choose global currency pricing over the dominant currency pricing, or PCP? Now, as in Dima's work, we know this is really kind of a complex question. There's multiple equilibrium, complementarity and price setting decisions, and so forth. So we just look at two cases. We look at this case where there's these financial shocks or kind of high monetary variability, and then a second case. And this is not in the original paper, and it's just a very kind of recent addition we've done. So it's still kind of in transition. We introduce an extended model with complementarity and price setting. So how much time have I got? Yeah, we got 10 minutes. So with financial shocks, we have a lemma. I'm not going to go through the lemma, but I can just say that with sufficiently large financial shocks, global currency pricing will be endogenously chosen by firms in all countries. So think about it this way. Let's say, we just had these financial shocks, and we didn't have the productivity shocks. Then global currency pricing will allow individual firms to more accurately target their desired prices, because the basket will endogenously kind of diffuse all these idiosyncratic country-specific financial shocks. So this will kind of happen as a result of the diversification, essentially, of these country-specific shocks. So global currency pricing, then, if we write down a model and ask firms to choose between different pricing strategies, in this case, with sufficiently large individual country-specific shocks, they'll always choose this GCP. Okay, so the second case where GCP may be endogenously chosen would be when we extend the model to allow for pricing complementarity. And so in the what I've described up to now just has kind of standard CES preferences. Now we allow for this Kimball aggregator, which Dima and Oleg have used in a lot of their work. And this gives rise to complementarity in price setting. So we're still kind of working on this. So I'll just tell you the results we have now. So we have a 3-country example. And here's what we do. We assume that monetary policy is set as optimal for producer currency pricing. And we're looking at, as in Dima's 2022 AER paper, we're looking at the situation where there's kind of a flexible price outcome, but in an individual firm can choose within this framework, in this limit flexible price, what currency it would like to set its price in. So the assumption is firms expect other firms to choose PCP. Then we allow for GCP and look at the range of parameters under which PCP, LCP, or DCP represents an optimal choice. And this is in our 3-country example. So on the left-hand side, we've got a world where there's no GCP, and we see that PCP, tends to be pretty much dominant, and that's kind of not so surprising because that allows for more flexibility, and also we're assuming that monetary policy is determined by DCP here. Then we see there is a phrase where with a lot of complementarity we get DCP, and that's DEMA's result, and then we can have possible LCP. But then when we open up global currency, we see with a lot of complementarity, we get quite a large area with a lot of complementarity and more home bias. We allow for we get GCP. So the conclusion is that there is like a substantial range of parameters where global currency pricing could be endogenously chosen in this three-country setting. Then finally, I just have a little bit of time left. We do this experiment, kind of this transition experiment, again following DEMA's paper. We asked, how pricing equilibria may depart from DCP when we allow for GCP as an option. So again, we focus on this three-country model with pricing complementarities as before. And let's say the US is country 1, the EU is country 2, and the rest of the world is country 3. And we let the US be larger than the EU. I guess that's not strictly true statistically speaking, but we're thinking of the EU as the Eurozone now rather than the full EU. And the rest of the world is a bit smaller. And so we go through this iterative process. At the beginning, at time 0 minus, we have the parameters of home bias and complementarity are set to produce a stable equilibrium dominated by dollar currency pricing, or DCP. Then at time 0, the global currency with the given basket becomes available. And firms have the option to price their goods in either the dollar or the newly introduced global currency. They've only got two choices here. So then in the first step iteration, we guess that each firm guesses that all other firms will choose the dollar, and they're making their decisions accordingly. Then for S greater than 2, we update our guess based on the currency choices in S minus 1. And then firms realize that other firms have chosen this. And then this process continues until all expectations are the same as their actions. We have like a rational expectations equilibrium. And then we, in some sense, this is a Nash equilibrium bias against GCP adoption because it starts, with an initial guess where all firms use the dollar. So this is kind of what it looks like. And let me just kind of quickly go through this. So alpha 1 is where the US, the share of the US, alpha 2 is the share of the EZ or Europe. And then this diagonal line is where the rest of the world has 0 share. So the arrows here are imports and exports from the US to EU to rest of the world, and back and forth to the US. And it's broken into 7 regions. The region G, where everything is red, is where we have a DCP, dollar currency pricing. Where it's deep red, everything is dollar currency pricing. The region where we have the possibility for global currency pricing is if the global basket has a high US share, as the US share becomes very high, the EZ share has a very low share, and the rest of the world has almost no share. If the rest of the world has a very high share and the global and the EZ and the US have low shares, then we have dollar currency pricing. But then as the EZ tends to have, even if the rest of the world has no share, if we're along this diagonal line, but we reduce the US share towards zero, then we get dollar currency pricing as well. So we only adopt the GCP in the situation where the US tends to have a high share.
Sorry, Mick, can you repeat what do you assume about structure of this global currency basket? And is it and what about monetary policy? Is it optimal or?
Yeah. Monetary policy is chosen optimally. I believe we do the optimal. Yeah, I can't remember. I think monetary policy is chosen as optimally under PCP.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I'm just curious whether you also update the basket during this transition or not. But yeah.
Oh no, we don't update the basket. This basket is just for each. So for each basket, we solve it separately. So for each possibility here, we just run through we determine this self-consistent equilibrium for each of these baskets.
So even when firms switch from dollar to this basket, you don't change the basket weights itself.
No. So what we do is, for each combination of baskets, we don't change the basket weight. Yeah, for each combination of baskets, we just solve these. So this is under the assumption that the parameters are set to produce a DCP, and in the first iteration, all firms will choose the dollar, and that's assumed by it's the assumption made by each firm when they're basing their choice in the first iteration. So in the alternative specification, we assume as at S equal to 1, firms conjecture that EU firms or EZ firms will set prices in GCP. Then we have a larger area in which GCP would be an equilibrium. And remember, this very dark green is where all firms use GCP, and then the very bright red is where we have DCP. And then on the right-hand side here, we have a different conjecture, the conjecture that all firms will choose GCP at the beginning, and then we look at the choice of individual firms, and we look at a self-consistent equilibrium. Okay, so I think I'm pretty much done here. Exactly 9 o'clock, right on time. So here are the main findings. Again, I'd say this is just kind of a speculative paper. It doesn't, we don't have this realistic situation, but the question is how GCP would affect exchange rate pass-through, the international transmission, optimal monetary policy. We look at the optimal composition of a global currency, and it does depend on the stance of monetary policy, cooperative versus non-cooperative. We have that GCP may be a kind of a welfare optimal situation if we have enough idiosyncratic country-specific financial shocks, in that it can kind of diffuse the effect of financial shocks on international trade. We show that pricing complementarities maybe lead to a larger role for GCP. We've done, a bunch of robustness. We've introduced intermediate goods. We have a full kind of dynamic Calvo pricing version of the model, which gets very messy, but doesn't change the results. And you know, one thing we'd like to do is look at at a much more kind of quantitative application of this model, looking at Model 2 based on international trade patterns, and maybe looking at what the optimal composition of the SDR would be and how the current SDR would deviate from this. Okay, so that's pretty much it.
Okay, thank you so
Thanks a
much.
lot.
Yeah, thank you very much for the wonderful talk. So following this will be a discussion. So our discussant today is Dr. Dmitry Mohin from London School of Economics. His research interests are international economics and macroeconomics. All right, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks a lot for the opportunity to discuss this paper. I saw Mick presenting this paper at another conference, but we didn't really have much time to talk there, so it's a great opportunity. Okay, so I guess the first thing I should say that, as everyone probably noticed, it's a very rich paper, right? It does a lot of stuff, and eventually maybe the authors will have even to split it into two papers, because it really addresses three questions, as Mick said, right? It's about optimal monetary policy, both cooperatively and non-cooperatively. Then it's about the optimal basket of currencies. And then it's also about endogenous choice, when firms would choose that basket as a private decision, right? So it's three separate questions. Of course, they all related to each other, right? They interact with each other, but they are different. Okay, so here's a quick summary of the main results and kind of my understanding, and I will also make some comments and ask questions about the setup. Okay, so the model has n countries of different size and I. To simplify the setup, the authors assume that preferences are logarithmic with home bias. So it's effectively standard Cole-Opsfeld parameterization that people use in this literature quite frequently. And the asset markets are complete, which allows to solve for exchange rate very easily. So one assumption that they make is that there's one period Calvo pricing, but effectively, right, qualitatively, it's the same as fully sticky prices, right? So there's kind of this parameter, the share of firms which adjust prices ex post. It affects welfare function, but it's just a constant term which doesn't really affect the optimal policy much. So one quick comment that I have here is that it must be, I think, some history dependence that authors started with allowing for non-tradable sector. In the end, right, they still make this assumption that productivity shocks are the same in two sectors. And in the end, it doesn't really matter whether you have this sector or not. It doesn't affect any results. And, at least for me, I was when I saw for the first time the setup, I was trying to guess what is the role of this non-tradable sector. In the end, it doesn't really matter. And so I think rather than generating this, this intrigue, I think it's just easier to skip non-tradable sector, and also simplifies notation. So here are kind of the main equilibrium conditions. So CJI is consumption of good J produced in country J, but consumed in country I, and tilde stays for the efficient level. And so given these logarithmic preferences, log linear preferences, in the end, it's easy to show that the optimal consumption is just proportional to productivity shocks, right? And productivity, it's a shock that happens in country J. So if policymakers could implement this allocation, they would like to implement this allocation. Now, what about the equilibrium consumption? Well, it depends on two things, right? The first one is aggregate demand. This is MI, so, right, how much goods are exported from J to I, depends on this aggregate demand determined by monetary policy. But then there's also expenditure switching, right? And remember that preferences are logarithmic, so the elasticity of demand is just one. And so this is expenditure switching. So when exchange rate of country I against currency in which good is invoiced depreciates, then there will be, this good becomes more expensive for consumers in country I, and so demand for this good goes down. Okay, so this X, it depends on the currency of invoicing. It can be dollar, it can be producer currency, or it can be local currency, or even a basket of currencies. And then, so this is again the property of the simplified model, is that the exchange rate between currencies I and X is just the difference in money supply of these two currencies. And then you can see that MI drops away, right? So the interesting property here is that if you print more money, you increase demand for imported goods because of the shift in aggregate demand, but your exchange rate depreciates, and therefore there's expenditure switching away from imported goods. And so these two effects, they exactly offset each other. And in the end, your monetary policy has no effect on imports, right? So what matters is really the money supply of the currency in which that good is invoiced. That's the key property. And many results in this paper, they follow from this observation. And then there is a loss function for a given country I, right? So I already dropped non-tradable goods. So there is domestic consumption of the domestic good, and ideally you want to bring this consumption close to domestic productivity. And then there's consumption of foreign goods, and again they enter with the weight nj, which is the size of country j. Now, one question, and again, it would be nice to have a long discussion with Mika at some point later, but I'm just curious how you derive this loss function, because I understand that when you aggregate all countries and you have a global planner, you just sum up these individual functions, and this makes perfect sense. But when you look at the non-cooperative case, why is it that exports don't appear in this loss function at all, and only imports appear? That, I mean, I just don't have a very good intuition. Maybe I just forgot. Maybe I did it at some point, but right now I can't see. So it looks like the exports don't appear here at all, right? And it seems like if country produces a lot to export, the disutility from producing these exported goods, it doesn't enter its objective function. And so that's something that I don't quite understand. I don't have good intuition. Okay, so and then there's this very nice table in the paper which summarizes the optimal cooperative and non-cooperative policy. So let me not go, through all these results. Let me just maybe very briefly mention that under PCP, as usual, you get divine coincidence, you get the first best allocation, and to do that, countries just need to stabilize their PPI, and it doesn't really matter whether it's cooperative policy or non-cooperative policy. But once you have, let's say, DCP, things become quite different, right? And it exactly comes from this property, right? So under DCP, if you solve for the optimal policy from perspective of individual country, then here you have money supply of the US. So individual country, non-US economy can't do anything about this term. And so it will focus only on domestic sector, right? While if you have cooperative policy, then you will use all policy instruments to stabilize this gap. So one small note, this is just small digression, but something that helped me to understand better the paper is that when you talk about Bitcoin currency pricing, that's, if I understand correctly, it's the same as DCP, but where US is very small, right? Then the global planner doesn't take into account the domestic objectives of the US, and it only uses US monetary policy to ensure the optimal trade between other countries, right? So I think that's just
right.
Okay, so let me now talk about the most interesting part, right? The new part about GCP. So one super interesting result is about optimal structure of this basket of currencies, right? And as Mick said, it's not only proportionate to the size of country, which I think I at least would expect, but it also has this second term, which is actually which depends negatively on country size. So why is that? So here's at least my understanding of this result. So if you increase the share of currency I in this basket, there are two effects. The good effect comes from the fact that country I exports its own goods, right? And so if you increase the share of currency I, then you will have a strong expenditure switching effect, right? So imagine that country I already sets MI equal to ZI, so it already has this standard optimal policy as under PCP. And so if you increase the share of currency I, then you will have a strong expenditure switching on the export side. So that's the positive effect, and I think that's what explains this first term here. But then there's also negative effect coming from the fact that country I also imports goods, right? And it will distort imports of country I, right? As I said before, so if we look at this term, imagine now that some fraction of this basket includes currency I, then monetary policy in country I will affect its own imports, and you don't want that to happen, right? I mean, you don't want this to affect to move together with ZI. And so I think that explains the second term here. So there is this non-trivial trade-off. So I think this I understand. So the most intriguing result is, of course, that once you have this optimal structure of currency baskets, the optimal monetary policy goes back to the one that you have under PCP, right? It becomes again optimal for each country to move monetary supply with its own local productivity shock and not respond to any global productivity shock. And I think Mick also agrees that that's the most interesting result. I would like to see a little bit more intuition, right? It would be nice to see why is that the case. I mean, at some very high level, I think I understand, but it would be nice to see why having this extra instrument, right, this artificial Bitcoin money supply doesn't add anything once you have this structure of the basket. And then, so one other interesting result in the paper is that if you have only productivity shocks, then you want to have PCP. You definitely don't want to have LCP, and DCP and GCP, they are somewhere in between, right? So that's more or less standard result in the literature, at least for PCP, LCP, and DCP. To be honest, I'm not sure I really believe in this result. And the main reason is precisely because of these financial shocks, right? We know that the correlation between exchange rates and different measures of productivity, it's quite low in the data. We know that there is kind of exchange rate disconnect, and at least at the high frequency exchange rates are driven by some news shocks or financial shocks. And as a result, I think we actually want low pass-through of these exchange rates into prices, right? So if all exchange rate is just noise, you don't want to show it up in relative prices of goods. And then actually you want low pass-through. So actually LCP becomes the best currency pricing, PCP becomes the worst, and DCP and GCP will be somewhere in between, right? And it seems like it's not exactly the result that Mick has in the paper, and my understanding it's exactly because the way they model it's a monetary shock which moves both nominal wages and exchange rates. And I think what is different about pure financial shock that it will only move exchange rate, but it will not move nominal wages, right? And I think it's very easy to check that. So if you just put some financial shock in the exchange rate equation, right? So where exchange rate is just MI minus MJ, let's put additional psi I financial shock, right? And this will be different from, it will not affect aggregate demand at all. It will only affect exchange rates. And then you can see whether wealth per ranking changes or not for these alternatives. That would be my preferred benchmark relative to just monetary shocks, which may be very important for countries like Argentina or Venezuela, but maybe play a much smaller role for developed countries. Okay, and finally, since I don't have much time, let me just go through this very quickly. So there is a very nice section in the paper about optimal currency choice. Again, the standard benchmark is that if firms choose PCP, then it's optimal for monetary policy to do PPI targeting. But once you have PPI targeting, it's actually optimal for firms to do PCP. So that's, it's internally consistent benchmark. And so if you want to deviate from there, you really need to introduce additional ingredients, right? You need complementarities in price setting. You might need intermediate goods, although that alone is not enough. And then you need non-productivity shocks, so something like financial shocks. And that's exactly the extension that they have in the paper. So the intriguing part here is that, Mick just showed these two pictures. It turns out that in the model, you can rationalize GCP equilibrium quite easily. And again, intuitively, it makes sense that generically you want, firms want to use basket of currencies rather than just dollar currency pricing. So I think it's a quite robust result for most parameter values. This should be true, but in the data, we don't see that. Maybe it's precisely because we don't have liquid enough baskets of currencies, although there is this IMF, right? but to me, it's an interesting question. Why don't firms invoice their goods in baskets of currencies? And so one comment that I have here is that I think one important ingredient that is missing from the model is this heterogeneity in trade flows, right? So it's unlikely to have one basket which fits everyone, right? So exporters from Europe to the US, they want one basket of currencies. Exporters from let's say Japan to China will want another basket of currencies. And so in the end, maybe it turns out that every exporter would say that there exists a basket of currencies which is better than DCP, but they will disagree on which basket. And that's why maybe in the end we don't have these baskets, right? So that I think that's another interesting possibility to study. Okay, that's all that I have. And yeah, I think that's a super interesting starting point, and there's so much to be done in this area.
Okay. Thanks so much, Dima. As usual, your discussion has really helped the author to understand his own paper more. So that was just terrific. There's lots of points there that we'll have to take on board. Just that last point you made, I think is exactly right. And I think in your own AER paper, you note that if individual countries could choose design their own basket, then that would completely eliminate the role of DCP. I think that's one of your results. Yeah, right off the bat, I'm not sure what the response is to that non-cooperative loss function. I'll have to look at that more closely and see. So yeah, I think you're right about the Bitcoin currency pricing is like equal to DCP if the US has a very small role. On the financial shocks, sure, yeah, I agree. If we just had completely volatile exchange rates which were not directly allocational, then yeah, we'd want to just stabilize domestic prices. I very much like your interpretation of the optimal share. We hadn't really thought about that before. How this good versus bad response to exchange rate change, and so we're going to have to take that on board and think about a better exposition of our results. So anyway, thanks again. I mean, this is really terrific.
Meg and Dima, can I ask a quick question? I don't know if this is if I understand correctly, individually the firm are choosing a currency or a DCP or GCP to minimize the volatility of profit, right?
Right.
So I'm just thinking, what's the role of the government here? Like, if the firms are like, I'm just thinking from Chinese perspective, like firms are kind of endogenously choosing DCP or GCP. Yeah, is minimizing profit, but if the government intervene and say you all need to invoice in Chinese currency, would that, I mean, presumably what they want is they want to switch the regime. And eventually, if the regime is switched successfully, the firm would optimally choose yuan, right? So my question is there a short-term, long-term trade-off here? Like in the short term, maybe intervening and increasing the volatility of profit, but then in the long run, I can move the regime. Does that make sense?
So you're thinking about the invoicing currency as a policy decision rather than
right.
as an individual decision.
Right.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting. I'm not sure I have a direct answer to that question, but one thing I can remember from one of our old papers with Jenny and Kine is that in our JIE paper from years ago, we found that the U.S. actually would be worse off in welfare terms holding the dollar as an invoicing currency because in our paper where the shocks were just driven by productivity, the U.S. suffers from a lack of expenditure switching, a lack of exchange rate pass-through, and that's an allocational distortion that other countries don't have because of dollar currency pricing. So that's not really an answer to your question, but I guess the answer is that China would not want to have everything invoiced in renminbi because according to our paper.
Yeah. That's a good answer. I mean, the other side of my question is more like, so what's the gain of being DCP, right? I guess from the model point of view.
I maybe let Dima.
No, I remember we spent with my co-author much time trying, torturing the model to produce some robust results. Why is it good to have your currency as a dominant one? I knew mixed results from the past. I thought maybe it's very special for these parameter values. I think there are just no robust results, to be honest. I mean, it can go either way, and it's just I think the wrong place to look for benefits of having a dominant currency. No, I don't know. I'm really curious what Mick also thinks. But my view is that once firms use dollar, let's say, or yuan as a currency of invoicing, that somehow also helps to promote your currency in financial markets, and then maybe you will get exorbitant privilege, right? It will become easier for you to borrow in your currency, something like that. But just in terms of expenditure switching, in terms of invoicing, I don't think there are robust gains for the country.
I see. Great, thank you.
Okay.
Ren, I don't know if you have anything to say.
I think one question I have is about I saw Mick also has some papers on the production network in the international model. So do you have any new works on this direction, or how do you comment on this literature in general?
We do have an extension with intermediate goods in this paper. We haven't really explored the full welfare consequences of that, but I would say on production network, I'm not the right person to be talking about this. I did one paper with Chang Hua on it, which basically had a very long gestation period and eventually came out, but there's lots of people are much more up to date on this literature than I am. Our paper just showed that the production network would be very important for fiscal spillovers when we quantified in the Eurozone, but that's all
Right.
I know about it.
Good. So before we wrap up today, we usually ask senior economists, so what are the interesting research project you are working on, and how do you see the future of the international macro research? So this is a usual question we ask more senior professors usually at the end.
Well, I mean, what I see the future is what young economists are working on now. People like Dima and Oleg, people like Majori and Schrieger and Perez, Ottinello. This work is just fabulous. I mean, I've at my stage in my career, I'm just really enjoying the bountiful gifts of these new policies on these new issues on understanding exchange rates, the issues of exorbitant privilege, issues of understanding how safe assets work, and these are questions that we were thinking about 20 years ago, but we just didn't really look at and have the the kind of modeling advances that are being done now. So I'm just I see, if you want to understand the important topics that are being done in international macro, the important future, look at the kind of work that these guys are working on.
Okay, thank you so much for many thanks to Mick for giving us such a great presentation. We have recorded it, then after we post it on YouTube, we will send you a link so that more people can know this research. And also many thanks to Dima for the great discussion. Let's just yeah. So let's just
Okay. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks
thank
for
you, Mike.
organizing.
Thank you, Dima. Thank you so
Thank you.
much. Thank you.
Right. Bye-bye.